Welcome to the 700 Club. Iran is threatening to attack the United States from within. The regime is also taking direct action against Americans. It's imposing sanctions on dozens of members of former President Trump's administration.
An Iranian military leader has gone as far as to call on followers inside the United States to take action. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem on this imminent danger to America.
Over the weekend, the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Quds Force called for people to take action within the United States. He said, wherever it is needed, we will provide for the basis of revenge against the Americans from within their houses and by people by their side without us being present. In reply, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declared, "Make no mistake, the United States of America will protect and defend its citizens. This includes those serving the United States now and those who formerly served." Victoria Coates is one of the 51 on the sanctions list who served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration. She warns Iran has attempted attacks on U.S. soil before.
They have expressed the intent to do violence against people in the United States. You go back to the 2011 plot against the then Saudi ambassador to the United States. Obviously, they are willing to do that.
So far, Iran has not been successful on U.S. soil, but Coates says they only have to be successful once. She says it serves as a wake-up call to the Biden administration.
I would like them to see the Iranian regime for what it is. This is what they do. And so when you are attempting to negotiate with them, bear this in mind. The smiling face you see across the table from you is maybe not the real face of this regime. And look at their actions, not at their words or what they might be willing to say in Vienna.
Coates warns about being too eager to enter into a nuclear agreement. In the meantime, talks resumed in Vienna to restart the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said Israel was not bound by the outcome of the talks.
Israel will continue to maintain full freedom of action anywhere and at any time without restrictions.
Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Congress, Yoram Ettinger, warns the U.S. administration is misjudging the Ayatollahs.
They seem to believe that the Iranian leopard can be induced to change its spots. The current administration in Washington assumes that terrorism in general is driven by despair, not by fanatic religious vision, but sadly divorced from reality.
After weeks of negotiations, there are reports the U.S. and Iranian officials believe they're making progress towards a deal to return to the Obama-era nuclear agreement. And last week, Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid told journalists he also believes an agreement will be reached. Gordon?
Well, Chris, any attack on the U.S., on U.S. soil, even a terrorist attack, if it's sponsored by Iran, that's an act of war. Why would they take that kind of risk?
Well, it's actually, as Victoria Coates said in our report, it's really what they do. It's who they are. They not only tried to kill that Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C., they tried to kidnap an Iranian activist in New York City. The FBI broke that up. But I think you need to see Iran and this regime not just through the prism of an aspiring nuclear power, but they are the world's state sponsor of terrorism. And they have terror proxies in Yemen, Lebanon. They have tentacles around the world. And Gordon, it's all part of their DNA that they would be so bold to go make threats. You know, it's interesting that they're in Vienna negotiating with the U.S., and there in Tehran, they're threatening U.S. officials or former U.S. officials.
In your piece, you have a comment from an Israeli that the U.S. State Department really just doesn't get it, that they think terrorism is driven by despair and not by ideology. If that's true, then I think we're all in trouble, that we're not understanding the true root of this.
Exactly. I mean, he was making the point in our interview that, you know, an economic or diplomatic presence, so to speak, to Iran is going to change their attitude. He made the point, and we've talked about this before, Gordon, they're driven by an ideology, a religious apocalyptic ideology that they want to take over the region, the Middle East. They want to take over the world. So what the U.S. is doing by trying to give them incentives, economic incentives, diplomatic incentives to stop their nuclear program or to, stop threatening U.S. officials really not going to work. And as he said, you're not going to change the spots on this Iranian leopard by these economic and diplomatic incentives.
Well, right now, Iran is launching missile attacks against U.S. troops stationed in Iraq. What is Israel's response to that kind of attack?
Well, one thing they're doing, Gordon, right now, they're assisting the United States with intelligence. They've actually helped the U.S. Some of these bases escape some of these attacks. But also what they're doing is they're carrying out their own deterrence. There's a shadow war going on throughout the Middle East between Israel and Iran. Israel has launched literally hundreds of strikes inside Syria against Iranian targets. Israel actually right now, Gordon, and we mentioned this before, they're alarmed by what the U.S. is not doing here in the Middle East, the lack of response against these attacks. And they point to three examples. Obviously, the main one is what they did, this administration pulling out of Afghanistan. That was just a profound U.S. weakness on the United States. There's also a place called Tanif. It's a U.S. base in western Iraq. It was attacked by Iranian militias. There was no response. And they were also alarmed, then they are currently alarmed at the U.S. position in the Vienna talks. And so Israel is looking at what the U.S. is doing or not doing, and they're really alarmed at the kind of weakness the U.S. is projecting here in the Middle East. And they're very concerned about what's going on in Vienna right now.
Well, all of this points out that Israel may have to go it alone. If we're going to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, Israel may have to go it alone. So are they even capable of making a first strike against the weapons program?
Well, in fact, just a couple of hours ago, Gordon, I talked to Yaakov Katz. He's the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He's the former defense analyst of the Jerusalem Post. Back in 2012, he wrote a book of how actually Israel could do it. A lot has changed since then, but a lot has remained the same. The bottom line is that they can't allow a nuclear Iran. You know, the Begin Doctrine, which means former Prime Minister Menachem Begin said, we will never allow one of our neighbors to get a weapon of mass destruction. But they also have to weigh the consequences. What you're going to have is an immediate war with Iran if Israel attacks the nuclear facilities, the proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas as well. And then they have to weigh the consideration. Will Iran just rebuild once they attack? But they do have the capability, I believe, Gordon. Whether or not they launch that strike remains to be seen. But right now, all the eyes right now are watching the talks in Vienna, and also as Iran gets closer and closer to a nuclear weapon.
Well, Chris, thanks for the insight. Thanks for the reporting. And for you at home, please pray for this administration, regardless of your politics, regardless of whether you voted or not for the current president. That doesn't matter. We need to come together as a nation. The struggles that we are facing right now and the perceived weakness of America in the world opinion, and that weakness is directly based on our political divisions, that we can't come together. We can't unite together. Well, we're now seeing Russia rise up, threaten to invade Ukraine. We're seeing China make threats against Taiwan, impose their will on Hong Kong, imprison anyone who dissents. We're seeing renewed religious oppression in India, and there are no consequences to it. And this stuff that's happening right now in Iran, where they're saying we want to attack American citizens on American soil. Understand what that means. You can't possibly go to a peace treaty with people that do that kind of thing. But we seem to be wanting to do it. So let's pray that they get wisdom, that their eyes are open and they understand the true threats. And let's also pray for our country that we can come together and unite. One nation under God, indivisible. That would be wonderful.